My name is Jack Zenger. I'm the CEO of Zenger-Folkman, the author, co-author of a new book called The New Extraordinary Leader. My talk today with Dov Baron is going to be about, is feedback really a fallacy and does it fail, or is feedback something that's really valuable as a leader? What lessons can we learn that will make us better leaders? So stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty interview series. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm the founder of Full Monty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes absolutely everything. To find out more, you can go to FullMontyLeadership.com. So let me ask you, in what ways do you need to up-level your leadership? Are you a leader who encourages feedback from your team? Do you actually ask to receive feedback? Or maybe you're in the Marcus Buckingham camp and you don't believe that feedback works. Or is it how the feedback is delivered that counts? What's more is, if you took on that feedback and used it, could you use it to create leadership cross-training? Well, stay tuned because you're about to find out, because our guest has been inducted into the Human Resources Development Hall of Fame. You'll find out more about him in a moment. Remember, you can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our LinkedIn and Facebook groups by just looking for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. If you're a new listener, new viewer, I want to thank you for it. And strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. You can also catch us on traditional radio stations across the United States every Monday and Thursday. We always need your help in staying relevant, so please get over to wherever you tune into podcasts, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. You can also look for us on Roku TV, where there's over 100,000 subscribers. And if you're a regular listener, a big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. You can also catch us on Google Home and Alexa by simply saying play Dov Baron podcast. Again, I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. As a leader, whether you're a CEO, someone in the C-suite, a sales leader, an entrepreneur, leader in any capacity, you know that we can all end up living in a bubble. And we can, particularly the higher up we go, the more powerful we get, the easier it is for us to believe our own press. So how do we get a clear insight into how we're really doing outside of the metrics of numbers? How do we really get to know how we're performing as a leader? Well, the answer might seem to be feedback. Well, but does feedback work? Well, there was a Harvard Business Review article that came out with Marcus Buckingham and his co-author, and they talked about how it doesn't. But is that true? Or is it simply how the feedback is delivered and how it is required, how it's requested? Well, let's find out together. Our guest on this episode is Jack Zenger. He is the co-founder and CEO of Zenger-Folkman, a firm that increases the effectiveness of leaders. Jack taught at the University of Southern California and Stanford Graduate School of Business. He received a doctorate in business admin from USC. Jack was a trustee for the board chairman for the Utah Valley University Board of Trustees, and just completed 10 years as a member of the Board of Regents for the state of Utah. Jack Zenger has received the ATD's All-Time Lifetime Achievement in Workplace Learning and Performance Award, and as I mentioned earlier, has been inducted into the Human Resource Development Hall of Fame. He's authored or co-authored 14 books, and over 150 articles, blogs, and he's a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review and Forbes. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome the Godfather of Effective Feedback, Mr. Jack Zenger! Welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Nice to be with you, Dov.
It's good to have you here too, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, one of the ways we like to start our show, and it's always particularly fascinating for me when I have a more senior leader on to ask this question. In this world where we're always influenced by everybody and people are talking about who is powerful and who is an influence and all those kinds of things, one of my favorite questions is to ask, who is somebody that we might not know or maybe wouldn't suspect who's been a major influence on your life? Who's somebody who has really impacted you in the way that you see, the way you are as a leader or the way you see leadership?
I think the person that's probably impacted me the most, Dov, is Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker. And what has been so impressive about him is that throughout his entire life, he seemed to be ever more productive. He never lost his intellectual curiosity. He continued to kind of come up with brand new insights. And he's been a real source of inspiration to me, that people can have productive lives well into their 90s. And so that's one of my
inspirations. You ever meet Peter?
I've met him when I was working at USC. He came to give a speech at our university's executive programs. But I didn't know him well.
No.
I have some friends who are very close, were very close to him. But he just, from afar, was a great inspiration to me.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people Peter Drucker has actually impacted, isn't it? It's interesting for me when I listen to senior leaders, like that name consistently comes up,
Yeah.
And I wasn't introduced to him until many years after he was already a superstar. And I was like, what was I missing? So it's fascinating. Now, actually, you're talking about him being very productive late in life. Now, you, if you don't mind me saying, I believe you're 88 years old now.
That is correct. That is correct.
And you're still working full time. Some would argue that you might be beyond your prime and that it's time to put your feet up, go play some golf. What do you say to that?
Well, I say to that I love what I do, and I believe that people live longer and they live healthier and they live happier when they're working. And I have some friends who are kind of my age who are just kind of sitting around waiting to check out. And I think that there's something that happens to people when they do that they begin to shrink. And so I've elected to try not to do that. And
yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we know from the statistics that people die on average 7 to 8 years after they retire, right?
Yeah.
And yet people who seem to live long lives are the people who are not working like a madman. I mean, I've done that too, but who genuinely love what they do and they want to go to work because there's a chance to impact and have influence. And I'm really inspired by that. I'm asked all the time, well, Dov, you're in your 60s now, when are you going to retire? I'm like, when they put me in a box.
Yeah, that's right. I'll retire horizontally, not vertically. Yeah.
Exactly. My retirement package is a box. So when you and I spoke several months ago, we talked about something that I thought was a very interesting subject that I think is something very well worth exploring a little bit here. And that is leadership cross-training. We know about cross-training in fitness. The tennis player who trains with weights and resistance training, we never thought about that, back in the 60s, in the days of Bjorn Borg, you played tennis and you got better at tennis. But now we know that you need to do many different kinds of, and you have this whole philosophy around cross-training in leadership. Tell us about that.
Well, it's an interesting story. So my colleague and I, Joe Folkman, we began working on a book together. And he's the statistician, so he did an extensive analysis on the data that we had at that time. At that time, we had about 200,000 360-degree feedback instruments on about 20,000 leaders.
Wow.
Now we have more than 1 million 360-degree feedback instruments on at least 120,000 leaders kind of worldwide. Anyway, one day he came into my office and he said, we've identified these differentiating competencies, these things that really set apart the high performers from the average and not so good performers. But he said, there's one other really interesting thing I've discovered. And he said, for each one of those, we've called them differentiating competencies. Mm-hmm. There's a handful of other behaviors that always go hand in hand with those. So people who get high scores on that differentiating competencies get high scores on these behaviors, and people who get low scores on these behaviors. Mm. Do you find that interesting? And I said, wow, do I ever find that interesting?
Sure.
So what we discovered was empirically there is this connection between other behaviors. And much as the same connection would be in, you're on board lifting weights and running long distances to get aerobic capacity to be a good tennis player. So we don't pretend that we know for sure why they're correlated, but we know they're correlated. We can guess in some cases why they are, but the idea that, if you're really bad at something, it's fairly straightforward about what you need to do to kind of get up to average and, be adequate in that. Mm-hmm. If you're kind of really pretty good at it, now what do you do? I mean, do you want to be better at strategic thinking? Right. Do you read more books? Do you go to more seminars? Do you, read more articles? Do you talk with the experts in the field? Well, often you've done most of those things. So now what do you do?
Right.
And so what was fascinating to us was that this research showed this handful of other behaviors, which sometimes were a little bit obvious, but many times were not obvious. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that there can be behaviors that people could practice that would, from an empirical point of view, lead them to be even more effective at this competency that they're wanting to excel at. We found that very, very interesting. And so this idea of competency companions and the value of cross-training, we think is a really powerful idea, and it opens the door for people who aspire to become much better to have multiple pathways so that they're not locked into only one thing that they can do.
So when you think about this, can we go over some of those cores and what some of the additional ones were that really seem to stand out?
Yeah.
Because I think that leaders looking at this will go, well, I'm really good at this. They want to know, well, do I have some of those extras?
Yeah. So one example is in the world of strategic thinking. So, if you're not good at all at that, then there are some pretty obvious things that you can do. But one of the companion behaviors to strategic thinking and perspective is the practice of going out and visiting with your clients, with customers. Mm-hmm. And that isn't intuitive to everybody, but it when you stop and think about it, you can say, well, yes, if I am able to kind of have people understand why our products and services really relate to their business outcomes, you can make that connection. But it's amazing how many executives don't always think about, I'll be better as a strategist if I spend some time outside my office talking to the customers who use my product. So that's an example of a companion behavior which is not necessarily intuitive.
It's bizarre to me that somebody wouldn't think that might be a pretty obvious place to go.
Yeah. Well, it is a bit bizarre. So another one, for instance, has to do with this topic of integrity and character.
Right.
We know that that's a very central theme for many leadership competency models.
Yes.
And so if a person gets moderately good scores in that area, what do? And strangely enough, one of the companion behaviors to being seen as being a person of high character and integrity is the behavior of being assertive. And you say, wait a minute. Well, aren't those two different continuums? I mean, is being assertive, that's one thing, but isn't having high character and honesty, something else? Mm-hmm. And what we know is that they are empirically connected.
Right.
And, our conclusion is that maybe the connection is, use Enron as an example. So Enron was kind of a classic story. Yep. So there were lots of people who were aware of what was happening in Enron. But there was one woman who had the courage to write a memo to, the senior people inside Enron saying, what we're doing is not ethical. It's not right. We're going to implode if we continue down this path. She had the courage to kind of lay her career on the line.
Yes.
And so as you stop and think about it, you can say, oh, I can see that a person who has very high standards, but who sits by quietly and doesn't have the courage to speak up, that's a different person than Absolutely. The one who says, I'm willing to lay my career on the line in order to kind of uphold the ethical standards of our firm.
Yeah. It's something that oftentimes I think people put these things in separate boxes, but they're so intertwined because I think it's a nice, efficacy is a nice idea, but without courage, that's what it is. It's just an idea. And as Martin Luther King said, the world is not made worse by evil men, but by people who are passive, right? Who let evil people do their thing and just stand by, rather than saying this is not okay. Right. And I think in a world, particularly today with social media and, everybody's story is distorted. And so we don't know what's real and what's not real anymore. Oftentimes, the media now, news media has a bad name. It used to be we trusted the news readers. Yeah, right. Now we're like, whoa, I don't know if I can trust this. So, it's a fascinating thing that, for me, it's one of the reasons I am, I'm saying this, and I understand that many of my listeners and viewers maybe find this controversial, but I am so in favor of whistleblowers. I do not think whistleblowers should go to jail. I see whistleblowers as heroes, and and I realize that many of my listeners are thinking, well, that's unpatriotic or whatever it is. I understand that, but it's that act of courage. It's not an act of spite. The act of courage of saying, I don't feel like this is ethical, and I might be wrong, but I still have to put everything on the line. Like for me, that's like, wow, so few people have that. And that to me is probably the pinnacle of leadership.
Right. Well, for whatever it's worth, I totally agree with you. And maybe we've offended even more of our listeners, but I'm with you 100%.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Now, it's interesting because you brought up a subject there that, again, is in the time that we're in right now is a difficult subject because I think, again, it's misunderstood, not because it's wrong, but because it's misunderstood. And that is assertiveness, because assertiveness and empathy, people have those as two separate things. Mm-hmm. And I've always said, it's part of the work that I do with companies and individuals that I work with, I am a dragon who works with dragons. And people say, what do you mean by that? And I say, I breathe fire, but the fire I breathe is love. But in the process of that, some people sometimes get burned by that love because I will tell the truth. I will be integral. I will hold you to that fire in the process of that. And people are like, they don't seem to be able to grasp that I have so much massive amount of love. And at the same time, don't screw with me. Right? Yeah. Talk to us about that for your point of view, because I know you have a similar thing around empathy and assertion, and that those two things are not separate.
Well, absolutely. there are people who would argue that effective leaders need to be bold and assertive and very directive in their behavior, and that's a leadership strength.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see it exactly that way. That simply assertiveness by itself is not a strength. It's a behavior, but it isn't a true strength, because it doesn't always work in every case. And the more of it doesn't make you even better. Whereas we believe that the true leadership strengths, by definition, are things that can work in virtually every culture, almost every circumstance, and indeed, the more of them you do, the better you're perceived. So you can't be too honest. You can't be too strategic in your thinking. You can't be too good of a communicator, whereas you can be too assertive. Yes. Or you can be too enabling. You can be too passive and sitting back. So it's easy to mistake some behavior that in general it can be useful, but those behaviors aren't always exactly true strengths. And so we don't see assertiveness standing alone as being a total virtue. It does need to be combined. So it's like the two oars on a rowboat that using one oar only, you begin to kind of spin around in circles. Whereas if you use two of them, if they have a balance and they have a companion. So the combination of assertiveness with empathy and understanding makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think this is a key point that so often is missed, because the mind is very absolute, and we like to polarize and go, oh, well, like I am not a fan of command and control at all. But you still have to be able to stand up and say, you know what, we need to get this done. I am a huge fan of empathy, but if all you are is empathetic, stuff's not getting done, folks. Because I'm trying to understand the facts that you're struggling with X and Y and Z, but we're still not getting anything done. And so I can have all the tears and the boo-hoos in the world, but we're going out of business.
Yep. Yeah.
So we got to bring the two things together, right?
Absolutely. And that certainly has become something that's become clearer to me in the last few years. And that is that simply kind of bringing all kinds of behavior together and mixing them, stirring them all together, ends up making one very bland color. And vibrant paintings and vibrant art it is not just mixing all the colors together, but it really is, at times you have to make a decision and be directive. And then there are times where you need to sit back and listen and pay attention and ask lots of good questions. And it's the combination and willingness to kind of combine those behaviors at the appropriate time that really seems to be, kind of characteristic of the best leaders.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, as we bring this to that point, it actually brings me to something I really feel like is an important piece for us to talk about, because you've been in the leadership world for a long time and you've watched the evolution of leadership. And now we're in a time, I personally think that this thing is really good, is where now we are beginning, and I say that optimistically, we are beginning to see the importance of women in leadership and how there's been a great lack of women in leadership. And I think that a lot of the time that was because of the lenses we were looking through. Talk to us, I know that your firm is a research firm. Talk to us about women in leadership, or rather the lack that's been, and what we need to do.
Yeah, well, wonderful question. So one of the advantages of having a large database is that you can query that database and ask interesting questions. And so several years ago, many years ago, I was living in Palo Alto, California, and we did some work with Tom Peters, whom I'm sure you know about. Absolutely. And one day Tom Peters kind of just said to me, kind of in passing, he said, I really think women are better leaders than men. And I said, oh, interesting. And no data. He just this was a clinical observation that he made.
Right.
So a few years ago, I said to my colleague, Joe Folkman, I said, let's look at our database and let's just see women versus men. And what was interesting was we, at that time, were measuring 16 competencies that were quite characteristic of effective leaders in most organizations. And what we found was that women were statistically significantly better on 12 of those 16 competencies.
Wow.
Men were statistically better on 2, and then the others were kind of a wash. But we were really struck. Now, I don't want to pretend that these are huge differences, but they are statistically significant differences. Women really did excel. And what was fascinating was that this was true in different functional areas that have typically been thought of as being male bastions, the legal department, the IT department, the sales function, the operations side. Women were every bit as, they were statistically better than the men. It was true as you went up the ladder, to more senior levels of management, the women were getting better scores than the men. And so we published that data, and it did stir up a lot of interest, and it was widely kind of cited. And our point was not to kind of try to create a battle of the sexes, but it was to try to say to senior management, look, if you're thinking about appointing a woman to a senior position, we can tell you that statistically, your odds are very good that she will do really well in that position. Now, the reality is, as you well know, that as you move up the organization, you start out with slightly more women than men. As you move up the next level, it begins to diminish. As you move up to the top senior group, it's down to about 14%. As you move to the CEO level, it's down to like 3 or 4%. So something is happening,
right,
that eliminates either women aren't aspiring to those positions, or senior executives who are making the decision about who to promote are reluctant to do that. And we were trying to dismiss that last issue.
Right.
The boards of directors ought not to be cautious about appointing women to those positions, because empirically they're going to do every bit as well as their male counterpart. Now, how do we change that statistic from being 3 or 4%? I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see it 50-50. But I believe we're going to see it get better. And we can all do things to kind of help that cause along. And we're seeing around the country, we're seeing different organizations and different groups that are trying to help women raise their aspirations, realize their potential. What our data shows is that women in their younger years tend to lack self-confidence. And it's not until they reach about age 40 that they become on the same level as men in terms of their self-confidence. And then it gets to be slightly better as they go beyond age 40. So maybe there are some things that we need to do with younger women particularly. And so senior leaders in organizations need to kind of work with their highly talented younger women in the organization to help them see the potential that they have. And so it's a fascinating topic. But it's fascinating to us because most organizations that we encounter recognize that they've got a real shortage in their pipeline, but that they need more effective leaders. And we think that they're obviously not paying enough attention to this great group of talented women who, for whatever reason, aren't being considered for these more senior levels.
Yeah, we've had a lot of women leaders and people speaking about women leadership on the show, and it's a fascinating subject because there are many factors. I mean, there's the societal factors of the simple thing of that Women give birth, men don't. And so if they want to have children, if a couple wants to have a children, a man and woman couple want to have a children, then it's usually the woman who's going to have to take some time off. And we live in North America, where there is not paternal leave equal to maternal leave. And, so there's those societal standard things that are going on. And then on top of that, because women have lacked, as you said, lacked the confidence to own it. And there's another piece of research that was probably about 10 years ago that was fantastic research. And it showed why women scored less. Maybe it was even your research. Why women scored less in their 360s as leaders. And it was, the bottom line was that they would not make the strategic vision decision because they didn't want that decision. They wanted it to be a collective. They were inclusive. And so they were judged lower because they wouldn't do command and control, because they would actually say, no, this is not up to me. This is us. And so they was that, because of the old thinking, the old command and control thinking, they were lowered in their score because of that. And it was like, wow, that is such a really powerful statement of where we've been. When something good shows up, we think it's bad.
Yeah. No, that's very much in harmony with our data. With the two leadership competencies on which men got higher scores were strategic perspective and technical professional kind of competence. But those were the only two where men had consistently higher scores than women. And so, yeah, that willingness to kind of think broader, longer term, more strategically, and to kind of own up, or take responsibility for that decision seems to be a little bit more uncomfortable for the women.
So, is there somewhere that our viewers, our listeners, can go and get their hands on this research? Because I'd really like people to understand, to really look at some of the data on why it is to their advantage to hire women and bring women up through the ranks.
There is. They can go to the Harvard blogs and just look under the Zenger-Folkman name and enter in the women topic. And if any of them have a hard time locating that, if they want to kind of connect with us through you, or if they want to come to us directly, we'll be happy to respond and give them links to that. You bet.
Good. Yeah, we'll make sure that's in the show notes too. So let's move on to your new book. And I put that in quotes because this is the third edition of the book. The book is titled Extraordinary Leader. Tell us a little bit about the book and what's different about, the third edition of it versus the first or second.
Happy to. Well, the first edition was published about 15 years ago, and it had a database with about 200,000 360-degree feedback instruments and 20,000 leaders. So the first obvious difference is that 15 years later, we now have 1 million 360-degree feedback instruments around the world. And so we have a lot more data. And so things have changed a little bit, as you would expect. So all the data is updated, and in the original book, we had 20 insights that we had gained from this research that we'd done about leaders. The new book has like 33 insights. So we've added to the number of insights that we talk about. That was probably the biggest change in the book, is that we've added a section in the middle that was focused on what organizations can do to help create their strong leadership pipeline. So the original book was very much focused about individuals and what individuals need to do about managing their own kind of development and what we knew about individual leader behavior. But we've come to realize that people work for organizations, and there's lots of things the organization needs to do in order to create the environment for leaders to really develop. So they need to have, the organization needs to step up to the fact that they can't just be developing 10 or 15 leaders a year and think that they're going to be, satisfying the need for this leadership pipeline. They've got to be willing to kind of increase the scale,
yes,
scope of what they're doing. They need to use powerful learning methods if they're going to try to change behavior. We think developing leadership is all about changing behavior. We know that it has a lot to do with the kind of support that the executives give to this whole initiative. So ways of garnering that support from executives is really key. We know that there's a lot that involving your immediate manager in this development process makes a big difference in the ultimate success of it. And we know that the kind of sustainment activities, the sustainment behavior, so that it isn't just a one and done activity. So there are 6 chapters in the middle of the book that really address those issues. And we think that particularly to the people with learning and development responsibility, the people in the HR function will find those chapters very, very helpful. They provide a template for looking at your own organization and saying, are we doing what's necessary to have a successful leadership development activity?
Do you think, Jack, I mean, with all the research you've done and the work you do with companies and organizations, do you think they get it? I mean, it seems to me like a lot of the times they don't get it. They don't get that the whole thing is way more fluid than it's ever been. Leaders move out of companies much faster than they ever did, and that they need to be looking to develop leaders from people stepping in the door, not waiting 5 years for them to say, okay, now you deserve the development. It seems to me like there's still a lot of old thinking around that. Do you see that the same or differently?
We see it the same. So interestingly enough, when we began doing our research 15 years ago, the average age of people going through our leadership development programs in our client companies was 42 years of age.
Right.
It's now 46, which says that we're waiting longer.
Yeah.
We're not taking those young 27-year-old supervisors and starting early. So the most sophisticated people that we deal with are the ones who, if you say to them, what would you do differently if you were doing this all over again? Mm-hmm. They say, would start earlier, would begin earlier in people's careers, would involve more people at more levels in the organization. So no, unfortunately, Dov, we don't think many organizations get it. We see big organizations, thousands of supervisors and managers, and they have maybe 30 or 40 people a year go through their leadership development programs, and they seem quite content with that. Sure. And you just scratch your head and you say, oh my goodness, your leadership pipeline has a little trickle kind of running into this pipeline.
Yeah.
And do you really think this is going to work? Yeah.
I just don't. I think that a lot of times the big companies are not paying attention to where they are in time, as in the way that leadership has changed, number one, and the way that, as I'm trying to remember his name right now, it'll come to me in a moment. But one of the things he said in the war on the war on talent, talent won. And you better pay attention to that, because they won, and they can go wherever they want to go. And if they don't want to go somewhere else, there was a time when you and I started in business when, we needed a chunk of money and a hell of a lot of hard work and a lot of time and a lot of help to do it, and possibly even a building. Now you need $20 and a website, and you can start your own business. So if you think they're going to sit around and wait 15 years to get some training, you're on crack. I mean, you're smoking the strong stuff and you need to wake up. So it's fascinating to me. I'm always in shock, particularly for leaders who are, 50 plus who are not getting that. I'm like, wow, you've got to learn that you should be training your 23s, your 25s, your 27-year-olds. You should be training them for leadership so they actually want to stay.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you think about the fact that the average supervisor gets appointed to his or her role, 27, 28, 29, And then you compare that to the average age of people going through their first development experience being 46.
Yeah.
Doesn't take a
crazy.
genius to kind of conclude there's a big chunk of time there when this leader has been performing with no formal development at all.
Yeah, crazy. So, when you looked at all these characteristics, and because you looked at the characteristics of individuals, and you've also talked about the characteristics of an organization, which I think is very important too. Where does purpose fall into that for you? Being a purpose-focused organization, how important is that in the organization and in bringing that forward into the leaders that they develop? Did that show up for you guys?
Well, the honest answer to your question, Dov, is that the 360-degree feedback work that we have and the data we've collected hasn't really focused on that mission-driven, purpose-driven kind of question specifically. Mm-hmm. But I'm a big fan of people like Daniel Pink and others who have kind of published, very extensively about mm-hmm. the clarity of having purpose and mission be clear and what it does to the motivation of people inside. Mm-hmm. So while that isn't one of the things that we've been measuring about organizations, there's no question in our mind that a purpose-driven organization is far more motivating to its internal people and will perform better in the long run than one that lacks that purpose.
Sure. It's interesting because, again, when we talk about millennials, people often think we're talking about kids, but millennials are going to be 40 this year, right? They're not kids, they're 40. And we know that from the research, millennials say meaningful work is right at the top of their list of things that matters for them. And if you want to keep your leaders and you want to develop your leaders, you've got to make sure that they are connected to the meaning of the organization, which is brought about in purpose. Now, there's a lot of there's not a lot, but there's become a lot of controversy surrounding the idea, the value of feedback. As I talked about at the beginning, Marcus Buckingham and his stuff in Harvard Business talked about how they believe it fails, and you are obviously in a very different position than that and have actually rebuffed some of that. So talk to us about these misconceptions around the feedback loop and the 360s.
Right. Well, we obviously have a very, very different position, and mm-hmm. and we think that the data is clearly on the side of leaders benefit from having objective, constructive, strengths-oriented information about themselves, mm-hmm. and that information that they can use to kind of improve their own behavior and performance. And some of the things that Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall talked about in their Harvard Business Review article, we just felt were not only not quite correct, but they were very, very misleading. So the idea that multiple responses in a 360-degree feedback process would be invalid is just not supported by anybody with any statistical background, who would very quickly say that, yes, it may be true that one individual giving you feedback, that their biases and their perceptions really color how they paint you. But when you have 10 or 13 people doing that collectively, that bias tends to go away and it is basically removed. And so we just thought there were some very misleading kinds of ideas, and that was unfortunate because the power of the 360 process from our point of view is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it's by far it's the most accurate, it's the most credible data, and especially when the participant has had an opportunity to choose who those respondents are. And so you're not asking enemies to kind of give you feedback. You're asking people who know you and whom you respect. And so we think when you bring that data together and provide it to them in a constructive way, we know that it makes a difference. And there's good evidence that it really does bring about change. And so we thought that the article in Harvard Business Review was unfortunate in that it kind of could be misleading to people who really were serious about wanting to improve their leadership effectiveness.
But I think that oftentimes, as we talked about before, I think that oftentimes we look at things in absolutes and it's on a curve. So I think that, this is my opinion, it's not the truth. My opinion is that a 360 given to 3 people, you're going to get some bias. There's no doubt about it because it's too small. And a 360 given to 30 people is going to have some bias because those people don't know you. They don't really interact with you enough to give an honest opinion. They're going to give a splash understanding of you. And so I think one of the critical things is knowing what is the ideal number of people in a 360 who actually have interaction with you. So they're not on that end of the scale, which is you don't really know me, you don't interact with me much, or you're on this end of the scale and I pissed you off a lot because I told you to do certain things that you didn't want to do, so, and that's the curve, right?
Right. And what we see is that, statistically on average, people who participate in programs that we're close to, what we sponsor, have on average 13 respondents. So what that usually means is it shakes out to be 6 or 7 subordinates, 4 or 5 peers, their boss, they do it themselves. On occasion, they'll maybe ask a supplier or a customer to give them feedback. In my case, I ask my wife. And that's a whole new that's a whole new.
It's really opening you up.
But when you get that number, they are people who work with you day in and day out. They have a pretty good sense of your strengths and the things you don't do as well. And by combining that data, you basically eliminate any strong bias.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I have seen 360s that I thought were really bad. And the reason for it was a very small group, or the framing of the questions. And I think this is an important piece. The framing of the questions was set for bias, positively or negatively. And I think that's the nuance of it, right? It is the nuance of it. So how do we get to that, being able to deliver the questions in a way that really allow people to disqualify some of that bias, because it's like that becomes a problem?
Well, I can tell you what we did in our case. So,
Thank you.
So Joe Folkman, who again is the statistician of the firm, what Joe did was to look at the aggregate data and look at those items that best predicted the aggregate score.
Right.
So there were some items that were very powerful, and then there were some items that were not very strong, not strong predictors. So in the case of the 360 that we provide, it is not somebody sitting down saying, what do I think is a good question about leadership behavior, but it's what empirically, which items truly do differentiate and predict the aggregate high scores and aggregate low scores. So I think there's a big difference between doing it haphazardly and sort of impressionistically versus doing it empirically. And so that would be our strong bias about how you create a high quality, valid instrument.
And that's what that's why I wanted to ask you, because I think that a lot of people who, I know because I've been in companies where they've done this, the 360 is designed internally. It's not done haphazardly because they do genuinely care, but it's not empirical, or as empirical as it could be. So do you think that if XYZ company is wanting to do a 360, that they should, there are certain companies that deliver the ones that are the best, or should they, because most of them are saying, well, we'll just do our own.
Yes, and I think the reality is, Dov, that in many organizations, historically what's happened is that you've assembled a group of executives and somebody has said, so what do you think makes a good leader for Ajax Manufacturing Corporation? And so people they pool their ideas.
Yes.
That's one very common approach.
Yeah.
The other common approach is that there's been a big internal controversy about what makes a good leader. And so finally the CEO in exasperation says, I'll do it. And so he or she sits down and sort of dictates, here are the competencies. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen very well respected, very well known Fortune 500 organizations where in exasperation, the CEO has said, okay, I'll decide. Now, this is all done with really good intent and using his or her best wisdom. But that's very different than doing it empirically.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think there are some instruments out there that have been created through good research, and we would obviously gravitate very much toward those.
Of course, absolutely. So I want to ask you, what's the question that we need to ask, not in a 360, but to be even asking ourselves, what is the question we need to ask in order to be better leaders? What do you think is that question we need to stop and ask ourselves?
Yeah. Well, I think it's to ask the question about where are my blind spots? What is it that I don't see about myself really clearly? I don't think any executive that I know gets up in the morning and says, I want to go to work and do an average job, or I just want to get by. I mean, I think we all drive into work in the morning and we want to do our best and we want to make good decisions, and yet we don't always do that. And it's because we don't always have a clear view of where our strengths are and where our flat sides are. So I think that this opportunity to get objective data and a fresh perspective about what we do well and what we don't do so well is maybe the question that we need to keep asking. And what is it I'm not paying sufficient attention to? What is it that I'm not seeing as clearly as I need to? I think the willingness and the ability to ask good questions of our colleagues is a real key. And that's why, some recent research that we've published around this topic of feedback has pointed out that, giving feedback is one thing, but if you want to be perceived by your colleagues as being a really good leader, the thing to do is ask your colleagues for their feedback to you. And your willingness to ask for feedback and then to take it seriously and do something about it makes an enormous difference in terms of how you're perceived as a leader.
We've actually come full circle around this whole issue around integrity and how that relates to courage. Many years ago, my wife was in the world of dentistry before she became my business partner. And I was speaking with her then boss, who became a friend of ours. And, he was talking to me about business consultants who came into the dental industry. And he said, he knew several dentists who'd brought in these business consultants, were going to show them how to revamp their business and make it more effective. And he said, he had only met one in all of his years. I mean, this guy was he was in the top 5 in the world for what he did. And he said he's only met one that actually used what they were taught. And he said, because it's one thing to to recognize we need help. It's another thing to pay for it and get it. And that's the high. We brought in XYZ, we brought in Dove, we brought in whoever it is to come in and help us with this. But the next piece is the willingness to take the feedback and do something with it. That's a whole different bag of tricks, because now I have to publicly own that I have a blind spot. And for me, that is one of the foundations of a great leader is the willingness to say, I had a blind spot. Thank you so much. You showed that to me. Now I can do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It's the courage piece.
Well, it is, and it is so refreshing. So, this morning on the news, we hear that Hallmark cards made a bad decision about pulling back some advertising having to do with LGBT issues. And the CEO kind of publicly says, we made a bad decision and we're going to change it. How often do you see that happen in today's world?
And it's outstanding.
Yeah,
it's so, for people like me and you, it's like, yeah, that's the thing to do, of course. But I actually teach this in my trainings. One of the most things we've got to stop is actually stop saying, of course, because it's of course to me. That makes sense. That's what you would do. Right. But I realize as I look around, people don't do that.
No.
They shovel BS on top of it. And hope it, hope some roses are going to grow. Maybe, I don't know, but really owning that this is a problem. Oh, okay, yeah, we were ignorant. We didn't pay attention. We're sorry. We made a mistake, and we're going to do something about it. Phenomenal, and it does better in the marketplace, not just in leadership, but it does better in the marketplace. I believe it was Domino's 10 years ago, maybe more, who came out and said, our pizza sucks. They said it. Our pizza sucks. How can we make it better? And took all his feedback. And in the recession, fast food companies do better because it's cheap food. And they outperformed all their competitors by 300%, 400%, 500%. Why? Because they said our pizza sucks. Help us make it better. And they did. Love it.
Yeah.
Genius. It's now, I think it's kind of bizarre. The honesty is now genius.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a genius. He told the truth. Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
This has been a fabulous conversation, Jack, and I really want to thank you for sharing your time with us. As we sort of come to the end here, I'm going to ask you to share with our audience how they can find out more about you and about your company and the book and all the things that you do and all your wonderful resources. But before I do that, let's do a quick lightning round, if I may. Tell us a guilty pleasure of Jack Zenger.
You mean beyond my Swiss almond vanilla Haagen-Dazs ice cream? I mean, something.
Sure, that'll do too. Is that by the bucket load?
That's one of my vices. No, my guilty pleasure is my wife reminds me of this periodically, that for me, work is play, and sometimes play is work. And so I love what I do and hope I can continue doing it for a really long time. So my guilty pleasure is I come to work and I have colleagues that I enjoy being with, and I have the freedom to kind of spend some time doing some research and spend some time doing writing and spend some time doing marketing events and great variety. And so, gosh, I haven't worked a day in my life in the last 10 years.
That's pretty awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now, before we finish, I'd love for you to share with our audience a really practical tool, like something they can do right now, preferably within the next 24 hours, that will allow them to really sort of take in what it is that you shared and make it into some practical action.
Someone once asked me if you had a young man or one of your grandsons that came to you and said, give me a piece of advice about how to be a better leader, what would you tell him? And my answer would be, as a manager, people often will come to you and want you to give them the answer to a question. They'll come and ask you a question, and they do that for a variety of reasons. But if I had any advice to give to a manager, a leader in an organization, I would say, don't be so quick to answer their question. Mm-hmm. That the most effective answer is usually, what do you think? And I think the response about, rather than quickly giving them an answer, to get them to kind of tell you what they think, first of all, it saves you making some really bad decisions along the way. And secondly, I think it automatically conveys respect. It conveys that you value their point of view, you value their information. They usually are closer to the issue than you are,
Yes.
and they have some information often that you don't have. And so I just think that simple act of not instantly jumping in and answering every question that gets posed to you is a really valuable behavior. And so that, along with asking more frequently for people's ideas and asking for their feedback about what it is that you do, can be really helpful.
That's solid, absolutely solid, because we're all, particularly as we're busy, we want to jump in and give an answer so we can get things moving along. But, you know, I've often said that if you pay attention, you'll realize that people are not actually asking for advice. They're actually usually asking for permission.
Exactly.
So if you say, well, what do you want permission about? By saying, well, what do you think? They will usually tell you. Yeah. So thank you. That's very good. So Jack, please tell our audience, our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources.
So if they go to www.Zenger-Folkman.com, they can get to our website, and the website kind of gives them pretty clear directions on how they can download some white papers and get access to some blogs and information. And that's probably the most successful way to get to us.
Thank you so much. Again, that's Zenger-Folkman. So ZENGER-Folkman.com. Zenger-Folkman.com. Jack, it has been a pleasure and an honor, sir. Thank you for being with us. I really appreciate it. It's been a ton of fun. I hope you'll stay with us to the end. And for you, dear listener, remember you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes by going to our LinkedIn groups or our Facebook groups to Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. And if you're ready to develop your leadership and loyalty in your organization, then come talk to us at fullmontyleadership.com. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Barron, as a speaker or strategist for your organization, go to fullmontyleadership.com/consulting or fullmontyleadership.com/speaking. Full Monty Leadership, because you can't outsource authenticity. It's where we provide the essential leadership skills to rekindle and amplify the hidden loyalty assets inside of your organization by tapping into purpose. I want to thank you for sharing this show with everybody you know. Until next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the feedback that you're not listening to and how you can ask a little bit more, be a little braver, hold your breath, hold your voice, and take it in. Because it's not just the feedback, it's what you do with it. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deep greatness to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. I am out.